Good morning. Thanks, Mike.
I'm going to talk a little bit about New York, and then I'm going to try to compare the Vermont bill to what is going on in New York. And you'll see why I say try to in a minute. So
For the record,
for the record, this is Mike O'Grady, Legislative Counsel. In 2023, New York enacted a law signed by the governor in late 2023. It said beginning January 1, 2027, it shall be unlawful. You don't see the shall be unlawful language. It's not just not shown, but that's what the lead-in language is for the subdivision. It shall be unlawful for any person to sell, offer for sale, or use, or distribute within the state any corn, soybean, or wheat seeds coated or treated with pesticides with the active ingredients, those neonicotinoids, provided, however, that the commissioner, it's the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation, it's not the Ag Commissioner, may temporarily suspend the provisions of that prohibition at any time based on the Commissioner's determination after consulting the Commissioner of Agriculture that there is an insufficient amount of commercially available seed to adequately supply the agriculture market that has not been treated with pesticides with those active ingredients, or the purchase of seed that complies with the requirements of this paragraph would result in undue financial hardship to agricultural producers. When they issue that exemption, they have to publish an order on or before the October 1st, succeeding the date upon which it shall become law, and reevaluated on an annual basis. So that's their neonicotinoid treated seed ban. That is it. 2027, it shall be unlawful to do those things, sell, distribute, use, unless the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation issues that order that allows for them to be used because there's insufficient supply of untreated seed, or there will be an undue financial hardship to agricultural producers. And then there is a prohibition on the application or treatment of outdoor ornamental plants and turf, except for the production of ag commodities with the pesticide containing one of those neonicotinoid, it's shorter less, it's those three on or after July 1st, 2025, the active ingredients of two others effective immediately, and the provisions of the paragraph shall not apply where the commissioner by written order determines there's a valid environmental emergency. An environmental emergency is defined further down. It doesn't say agricultural emergency. Remember that. It says environmental emergency. So the pesticide would be effective in addressing the environmental emergency, and no other less harmful pesticide or pest management practice will be effective in addressing the environmental emergency. I will say that clause, that like if there's an emergency and this is the only pesticide that will address it, that's pretty common when you ban a pesticide and its use, because you want to give the state the ability to use something that is the only effective thing. And when I write bans, I usually include language like this. And then any order like that will include the basis for the commissioner's determination, specify the approved time period, geographic scope and purpose. The provisions of this paragraph shall not apply to pesticide applications by or under the supervision of a certified applicator for treatment against invasive species in woody plants. So that's an exception from the application to ornamental plants and outdoor. And then it defines environmental emergency: an occurrence of any pest which presents a significant risk of harm or injury to the environment, or significant harm, injury, or loss to agricultural crops, including any exotic or foreign pests which may need preventative quarantine measures to avert or prevent that risk, as determined by the department in consultation with the Department of Ag. So this is honestly, it's a pretty elegant and pretty well-written prohibition. It's pretty, you know, elegantly drafted for the treated seed, except it does have a pretty wide open authority for a suspension of that prohibition. And then the outdoor ornamental treatment, again, it's pretty immediate. You have two prohibitions that would go into effect immediately, effective date, and three that would go in effect 2025. But then it has some authority, and as I said, that typical if that there's an emergency, which is something I would recommend. And then defines what's an emergency. It's a pretty. I like it. I like it how it's drafted. It's only a page and a half, and has it has specific and pretty wide-ranging application, but it's a moving target.
So, John, do you have a question?
Yeah, so are like EIB and woolly adults already considered environmental emergencies? So that
You have to go through that whole process, and there has to be that determination that it's the only thing.
there are carve outs for them already in this.
Well, it's not a carve out for the specific pest. It's a carve out for the potential need for that banned pesticide for any pest. So it's not a carve out just for a specific type of pest. You have to go through the process because they're going to be on woody plants, right? And there isn't a certified there is an exception if it's applied under the supervision of a certified applicant for treatment against invasive species in woody plants. So maybe, but have they declared those invasive species yet? I don't know. You have to can't say for sure. I don't know the factual determinations that have been made in New York, but it's probably allowed for emerald ash borer or things like that.
So you sent us, or I'm not sure that the whole committee has seen it yet, but two different
Yes.
documents. And the
So
first,
So that was what was passed and is enacted and that the governor signed, but the governor in New York, instead of just having the authority to write a veto letter, the governors in New York can write an approval letter.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize Representative Levitt has had her hand up. She's on Zoom, and I want to make sure that she gets her question, and I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. My question is, we've been hearing a lot of people testifying saying New York is 2029, and what you're saying doesn't bear that out. So I'm curious if you could just speak to that specific date that we keep hearing in committee.
Well, that's what I was going on to.
Got it.
So the moving target is the current legislation in New York. 2023 was called the Birds and Bees Protection Act. 2024, it's an act relating to the regulation of certain coated and treated seeds. It hasn't technically become an act yet, but it's passed the Senate and it's gone to third reading in the House. So it's just a matter of time, most likely, and unless the governor somehow wants to veto it. But the governor said in her approval letter to the Birds and Bees Act that she was approving it with the expectation and the consent to changes to the Birds and Bees Act. And so that is what the current 8031 I have, but there's a Senate version. This is the Senate version. There's an Assembly version as well. So it would provide that beginning January 1, 2029, It shall be unlawful for any person to sell, offer for sale, or use, or distribute within the state any corn, soy, or wheat seeds coated or treated with pesticides with those specific neonicotinoids or any other neonicotinoid as determined by the department, again, it's the Department of Environmental Conservation, unless a valid waiver is issued by the department to the user under the subdivision. And the waiver provides the commissioner, in consultation with the commissioner of ag, may issue a waiver to allow the use of such seeds for the production of agricultural commodities. So that waiver is just for ag commodities. Doesn't define what ag commodities are, but they are defined elsewhere in New York statute. No such waiver shall be valid for more than 2 years. Such waiver shall be granted only if, at a minimum, the following conditions are met. The farm owner must complete an integrated pest management training. A pest risk assessment report must be completed. Any seeds may only be planted on the farm property or properties identified in the assessment report. The farm owner must maintain current records of such pest risk assessment report and records when treated seeds are planted. The commissioner, in consultation with the commissioner of ag, shall promulgate any appropriate regulations prior to undertaking the waiver. The department annually reports to the legislature on the number of waivers granted. But then you will see that all of that language that you just reviewed from the Birds and Bees Act regarding the prohibition of treated seeds in the Birds and Bees Act is struck. And instead, it shall be unlawful for a person to apply or treat outdoor ornamental plants. So the ornamental plant prohibition stays, but it's except for the production of agricultural commodities or structural commercial application with 1 foot of a building perimeter to manage structural pests, provided that the application is not conducted on any blooming plant. So if you've got termites and you can use that. And then and then you get to the timing of that. So remember, it was 2025 for those 3. It's now going to be December 31st, 26. And then for the ones that were going to go, the ban on ornamental application that was going to go into effect immediate, it's now December 31st, 2024. And then there's still that order authority for a valid environmental emergency. Same conditions. And that's really it.
John's got a question.
Like, could there be a counter argument that if there's an exemption and neonics are allowed to be used again, then it's an environmental emergency for pollinators?
That's not how it's written. I mean, I understand your point, but it's not how it's written.
So their waiver seems to be much more sort of tied to individual farms, whereas the waiver.
This one,
Yeah,
yes.
this one. Whereas the waiver in our bill is, I guess, could be an individual farm because they're required to cite a specific geographic scope, but.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also specific about the type of use.
Yeah.
And what it will be used on. So that can be very specific to a farm as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you want me to look at the Vermont law now, Vermont bill? So skip over the findings, whatever you want for findings, as long as it's adequately sourced and factually correct, except for, what the state should do. That's up to you. The first section is the definition section. Remember, there's 2 chapters in Title VI that relate to control of pesticides. This is the one about registration, and this is the one about the actual control. And it includes a definition of what's ag commodity, any food in its raw and natural state. That's basically how it's defined elsewhere in Title VI. You get a definition of ag emergency, an occurrence of any pest that presents an imminent risk of significant harm, injury, or loss to agricultural crops. You get a crop group because there's going to be specific authority or prohibitions on application to certain crop groups, and it cites the federal crop groupings. And then it defines environmental emergency, an occurrence of any pest that presents a significant risk of harm or injury to the environment, or significant harm, injury, or loss to ag crops, including any exotic or foreign pests that may need preventative quarantine measures to prevent the risk. So, Representative O'Brien, it's an occurrence of any pest that presents the significant harm. It's not the use of something that presents a significant harm. It's the pest that triggers what's an environmental emergency.
Are pests defined?
Pests are defined elsewhere.
Robin eating my vineyard grapes.
It's right, it's on page 5. It's any insect, rodent, nematode, fungus, weed, or any other form of terrestrial or aquatic plant or animal life, or viruses, bacteria, or other microorganisms that the secretary declares as being injurious to health or the environment.
So in this, I mean, we've been thinking about seeds in the ground and a maggot that likes to
Yeah, neonicotinoids are pesticides. A seed might also be treated with the fungicide. So neonics are pesticides,
so the emergency means an occurrence of any pest.
right?
So it's dealing with not the fungus. This
It's really an insect, yes.
In this context, secretary, is that secretary of ag or?
Well, you're gonna have to see, because,
page 7 is ANR.
right, because later on, you'll see generally in Title VI, secretary means Secretary of Agriculture. And I think I discussed when I walked through the bill with you, there are provisions that you are amending in this bill where the Secretary of Agriculture is given the sole authority to regulate pesticides within the state. You have to amend that because this bill provides that the Secretary of Natural Resources is going to be the one that's going to allow the waiver or the emergency use of a neonicotinoid that would otherwise be banned. And so it's the first time, in at least with the control of pesticides, where you are the Agency of Agriculture's authority is ceded in some way to natural resources. It's not the first time it's ever been done in any agriculture issue. Water quality issues on a farm, because of federal law, the Agency of Ag has to cede some of those issues to the Secretary of Natural Resources because of federal law and the delegation to ANR. But for purposes of pesticides, this would be the first time that ANR would be the one. You used to have the Pesticide Advisory Committee that was a check on the Secretary's authority, especially on the Secretary's rulemaking authority. And you replace that committee with the Agricultural Innovation Board. And that board is getting away from being the check on the Secretary's authority. At least that's the agency's perspective. You might want to think about that if you want to at all. There's definitions of what is an ornamental plant and turf. The definition of turf is drawn from elsewhere in Vermont statutes. And then you get to the operative language. So the first is no person shall sell, offer for sale, or use, distribute, or use any neonicotinoid treated article seed for soybeans or any crop in the cereal grains group. So that is corn and wheat as in New York, but it's also any other cereal grain. So right away, the Vermont prohibition is going to be broader.
So the New York statute includes soy,
The New York statute included soy, corn, and wheat,
but not a blanket.
not the blanket cereal grains in those crop groups. I forget if I identify what's in those crop groups. It did. But I have the crop grouping with me if you want me to go through that, but then the Secretary of Natural Resources, again, flipping the script, but consistent with New York. Remember, in New York, it's the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation may issue a written exemption order to suspend the provisions, the prohibition on the use of that treated article seed. Can be valid not more than a year. Remember, New York, 2 years, especially under the 2024 bill. And then the exemption order shall specify the types of treated article seeds to which the order applies, the date on which the order takes effect, its duration, and its geographic scope. It provides a detailed evaluation of the ag seed market, including a determination that the purchase of seeds would cause agricultural producers undue financial hardship, like in New York, or that there's an insufficient amount of commercially available seed not treated with neonicotinoid, again, like New York. But then it has to go on and provide a detailed evaluation of the order's anticipated effect on pollinator population. So Representative O'Brien, your concern, and will not cause undue harm to pollinator populations, bird populations, ecosystem health, and public health. That is not in New York. A written exemption order may establish restrictions related to the use of neonicotinoid treated article seeds to which the exemption order applies to minimize harm to pollinator populations. Again, that's not in New York. And it may establish other restrictions related to the use of neonicotinoid treated article seeds to which the exemption order applies.
Mike, would it come from the secretary sort of covering, industry-wide commodities, like, okay, corn, we have pressures with corn maggots, so there's an exemption statewide, or is it, farm by farm, if I'm an LFO and I'm having corn maggot pressures?
So this is different from New York, and this is not necessarily farm by farm. It does provide that it could have a geographic scope. Right. So if there is a pest need and, a pest control need in one part of the state, armyworm or something, then there's that ability for the Secretary of Natural Resources to limit the scope of that order.
Okay, so it could be one farm, but up to the whole state.
It could be up to the whole state, yes.
Like the exemption that we're talking about here seems more to do with the availability of seed rather than the
Undue financial hardship or the unavailability of seed. So undue financial hardship is that the pest could wipe out your crop.
Okay.
So upon any exemption order being issued, you all get a report on that. So you will be notified of any exemption order. It's not the first time the General Assembly gets this type of kind of a reaction report, but it's not that common. And then the Secretary of Natural Resources may rescind a written exemption, and such rescission comes into effect not sooner than 30 days after its issuance. So that's neonicotinoid treated seeds. Section 4. Just jump too.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
So timing wise, if farmers are ordering their potentially treated seeds in October or November, like that's off the board. So it sounds like if there was an exemption for a reaction to it at that rate, they would have to go to a foliar.
So yesterday I was in Senate Ag and we're talking to a or an employee. I don't know if he was he was somehow related to Irene, Senator Renner. And he works for Seedway, and he was saying that if you're going to have a prohibition like this in New York, they're gonna phase out their treated seeds probably a season or two before the prohibition goes into effect to get farmers to determine if they can provide the supply, and then to get farmers to a point where they are ordering the untreated seed. So with the prohibition being what it is and the timing of it, I think you're going to have time for the seed dealers to phase out before anyone has to start thinking about, oh, do I order treated or do I order not treated?
And the reaction would be a foliar.
Pardon me?
If the reaction, if there were, pest pressures, then that led to an exemption, then farmers would
Right.
come back with a foliar spray.
Right. So this is where Vermont really differs from New York, because New York was about prohibition of the treated seeds and prohibition to ornamental plants and turf. This is not limited to ornamental plants or turf. This is a prohibition on the use of any neonicotinoid pesticide, not just treated seeds, any neonic, the outdoor application to any crop during bloom, the outdoor application to any crop between heading or tassel and harvest, and the outdoor application to crops and leafy vegetables, brassica, bulb vegetables, herbs and spices, and stalk, stem, and leaf vegetable crop groups as set forth in the federal rules, the application of neonics to ornamental plants, and the application of neonics to turf. So those first three subdivisions are different than what New York is doing. Again, you have the ability to issue a written exemption order. Shall not be valid for more than a year. It specifies the neonic pesticide uses in crops to which the order applies, the date it takes effect, scope, a detailed evaluation determining that an ag emergency or environmental emergency exists, a detailed evaluation of reasonable responses available to address those emergencies, including whether or not there is no other less harmful pesticide or pest management practice that would be effective in addressing the emergency. Also will provide a detailed evaluation of the anticipated effects on pollinator populations, etc. It's issued, it may establish restrictions on the use to minimize harm. It may establish other restrictions to which the exemption order applies if our Secretary of A&R considers it necessary. Upon the written exemption order, you get that report. I like those reports, just as an aside. And that they may rescind any written exemption order at any time. And then you get a bunch of conforming changes. Section 5 is in the registration requirements for pesticides that the Agency of Ag requires. A few years ago, you required that neonicotinoids be registered as Class A or / restricted use pesticides, but you exempted certain types of neonicotinoid pesticides from that registration. A Class A pesticide, restricted use pesticide, may be used in the state. It just has to be used under certain conditions and if you're certified and et cetera. But you're prohibiting the use of them unless there's a written order. And so you want to remove treated article seed from the exemptions here. Similarly, we talked about how the Secretary of Ag, under my reading of statute, currently has the sole authority to regulate pesticides in Vermont. But you gave Natural Resources some authority to do that. You have to amend an agency of ag's authority and say, well, that's otherwise provided by statute, jurisdiction in all matters pertaining to the distribution, sale, and transportation of economic poisons. Remember, that's how Vermont defines pesticides, is vested exclusively in the secretary, and that secretary is the Secretary of Agriculture. And then similar change in the general authority for control of pesticides. Unless otherwise provided in the statute, the secretary shall have responsibility for regulating and controlling the sale, use, storage, etc. of pesticides and pesticides waste. You will see that language on page 14, line 11 to 13. In the performance of such duties, the secretary shall act upon the advice of the Agriculture Innovation Board and subject to the approval of the governor. Now, the subject to the approval of the governor language, that's really just antiquated. It's the Secretary of Agriculture. They don't really go out there and do things that aren't subject to the approval of the governor, or they won't be the Secretary of Agriculture. So we've been actually in other statutes getting rid of that subject to the approval of the governor language. But you still see that the secretary would need to act upon the advice of the Agricultural Innovation Board. That's a policy decision for you. There are other regulatory mechanisms like this across statute. And then Section 8 is, remember, you required the Agency of Ag to adopt by rule best management practices for the use of neonicotinoid treated article seeds. You're not going to allow the use of treated article seeds anymore. Or do you want to have best management practices when they're authorized under a written exemption order? This would repeal them, but I think you have a kind of a policy discussion about whether or not there should be them if there's a written exemption order. And then the effective dates, the findings, the definition, those registration requirements, whether it's going to be a Class A or restricted use, and the prospective repeal of the BMP rules take effect on passage. The BMP rules are being repealed on passage because they're due in July. But they're not going to be issued in July. Let's be real. And then page 15, line 1, section 4, the prohibited use of neonics, and sections 6 and 7, the authority of the Secretary of Ag, take effect July 1, 2025. And then the use of the treated article seed takes effect January 1, 2027, because that was what was the law in New York at that time. It was 2027. Technically, it's still a law, but not for long. It was 2027, and the sponsor wanted to true up that prohibition date, that effective date with New York. It's up to you if you want to go sooner than 2029 now.
Do you happen to know in New York State whether generally the equivalent of A&R has regulatory authority over pesticides in general?
Generally, they do. It's supposed to be a very coordinated effort with the Agency of Agriculture there. I will say that it's common for agencies of agriculture to be the ones in states that regulate the use of pesticides, or they even have, in some states, they have boards that do it. Like Arkansas. But boards can get in real trouble because they can be very. It's happened that boards get challenged a lot when they prohibit something, because it's usually argued that they didn't do it based on the evidence and the science in front of them, because they're they're acting on a petition from someone.
You're talking about boards in general?
These pesticide boards and or ag boards in other states. So it's pretty common for agencies of ag, departments of ag to be the ones to control, because FIFRA was enacted in the 50s, and the people that were using pesticides then were farmers.
John, you had a question?
Yeah, Mike, so what doesn't fall under this prohibition? So things like take pills for pets, carpentarian or termite controls,
So
injection to kill emerald ash borer.
let's look at that use of neonicotinoids. So it lists the specific applications that are prohibited. So any application that's not specifically prohibited is allowed. Because the first couple section is about treated seed. Now this is about outdoor application to any crop during bloom. So that's not your lice. The outdoor application of neonics to any crop between heading or tassel and harvest, the outdoor application to the crops that are listed, the application of neonics to ornamental plants, and the application of neonic pesticides to grass. So you still want to register or still want to exempt any, you want to register any other neonic as a class A or restricted use, right? And then you exempt from that regulation, pet care, personal care, that's the lice or bed bugs, and indoor pest control products used for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating. You could maybe clarify that unless otherwise prohibited, the secretary shall register as a restricted use pesticide any neonic. That might be a clarifying point there on page 13, line 5. The lead into subsection F. That's that.
Right, it's very helpful, thank you. I'm gonna suggest if there are any other questions that we let you go back to the Senate or wherever you're headed next. Unless you want to stay.
I would want to stay. Allowed to
Sanctuary
stay.
here. But Graham, would you like to come up next? And then, BJ, we've got your applicant. Thank you, Mike. Morning, Graham.
Morning, everybody. My name is Graham Unangs Struffenacht. I'm the policy director at Rural Vermont. I think this is my first time before you all this year. Thank you. Are you ready for me to begin?
Yeah, we've got you, so we're continuing to talk about the same bill, H706, and be happy to hear what your thoughts are.
Great. I have some more or less prepared statements. I'll be sending them to you all after later today. I just say as an introduction, you all have taken a lot of testimony on this. I've done my best to listen to most of it, but I have not gotten to all of it. And so throughout my testimony, I'm going to try to respond to some of what I've heard that you all also heard. So today I am providing testimony for Rural Vermont in support of H706. I would say with the caveat that, we're willing to work with changes, both to support farming community and otherwise, and more broadly with the goal of reducing and eliminating the use of and exposure to pesticides and supporting the farmers and others currently using them and transitioning. So this is also a position that's broader alignment with our national and international partner organizations. That's the National Family Farm Coalition and La Via Campesina. So there are larger national and global movements working on this as well. Just I think it's worth you all knowing, as you already do from the legislation in the European Union and other places as well. So this bill is about meeting the realities of the data on neonics and supporting a just transition for those using them and those affected by them, in our eyes. Rural Vermont and a number of organizations who support this bill have worked for a number of years in relationship to different pesticides and neonics in particular. This effort and this bill is not something novel, and I don't think it should be unexpected. We worked to have neonics other than treated seed registered as a restricted use pesticide in 2019. At the time, we announced and expected we would be back next working to address seed. Then the pandemic occurred, and really a lot of this was put on the back burner. There was the year in which the AIB was created, and now we're back with a number of the same and other organizations seeking this change that we talked about coming back for a long time ago. So I just want to step back and go into a little bit of the framing of this bill and how it's been discussed in this committee. You know, in our eyes, this is not a bill about putting farmers out of business. It's not a bill about transitioning a land from conventional dairy farming in Vermont. It's not a referendum on row cropping corn in Vermont. And I don't believe it's helpful or accurate to be framed in this way. This bill is discrete and targeted. It's about a single class of pesticides, seeks to provide the support needed for producers currently using them to transition. And as I said, as an organization, we certainly support working with those organizations and farmers to understand what they would need to move forward in this way. It's modeled after other existing legislation, as this committee is well aware, around the country and around the world. In countries and regions in which similar legislation has passed, there have been no documented negative impacts on the agricultural community related to these changes, including no loss in yield, as was testified to a number of times throughout different testimonies you all received. So the testimony you've received has demonstrated the precarious nature of our food system, farming, seed, and land access systems. And I think one of my challenges in watching all this testimony was how that was sort of conflated with this bill and this particular action. So numerous farmers and consultants spoke to the economic and climatic and environmental vulnerability of farmers and farms. We do have immense systemic and complex problems that need to be addressed. This bill is about a discrete problem. And yes, it's part of a greater complex, and not pretending that it's not, or that farmers are not involved in a global marketplace, especially a lot of those using these particular seeds. Stephen Collier brought up the New England Feeding New England study. As you all heard from that group when they were in here, Vermont is currently severely import dependent in the vast majority of its food needs. Across New England, we'll need an additional 400,000 acres of land in underutilized production and an additional 590,000 additional acres of new cropland to even meet 30% of our regional food needs. According to a study by the American Farmland Trust, which Stephen also mentioned, approximately 41,200 acres of Vermont's existing ag acreage will transition out of production by 2040 if we continue on current development trends. And the worst case scenario is far greater than that 41,000 acres. We need more farmers. We need more land and agriculture. We need more support for those already farming. And we need more support for new farmers. This conversation is not about taking any farmers away or any acreage away or causing that. This bill assures and works to assure that as we bring this new acreage on and as we maintain and improve our current acreage, supporting new and existing farmers, that we are not further spreading what we know to be harmful, persistent, mobile agrochemicals that are new to our communities and farms as self-determination in relationship to the crops they grow and the food they eat. I want to reaffirm something that Maddie said from NOFA when she was in here and that Heather Darby said. Heather related a story on the time period when neonics transitioned from an optional treatment to an automatic treatment. And the reality that the reality that like this conversation we're having, one of the primary barriers that consistently is pointed to is the real or perceived inability to choose whether or not our seed we plant will have a particularly proprietary product on it. This isn't about whether or not the varietals are available. It's about whether or not they will be available as they once were, as an option, as opposed to a requirement. Nobody is taking away varietals. We are saying those varietals cannot contain a particular pesticide with known, dangerous, and widespread impacts, which almost all the time do not economically or agronomically help farmers, according to the data. Now, it's not, I'll get into why it's still valuable for farmers later and why that was an important thing that was brought up by Tucker and others. But generally, this dynamic with these companies and these products should be really concerning to all of us. And it gets right down to we talked about self-determination and our democratic principles around food. So in response to some of the concerns and questions that were raised, people remember deal. So the advantage the fact that these farms are part of a global commodity system, as we mentioned. We need very much to support them. We cannot deny the science about the impacts and continue to use them. So we support doing what we must to provide support needed for farmers as they transition. And this bill will give us some time to plan and work to address these concerns and grow greater regional movement towards this transition. I'm not sure if you've heard from other organizations in Connecticut or Massachusetts or Maine or any of these other northeastern states, but we have heard over the last number of years folks entertaining very similar legislation. And this work in New York and now here could potentially be really helpful in bringing more states on, we believe. So we cannot not act any longer. We must recognize as well that the federal government, though provides many supports through NRCS and other programs, including substantial grants supporting capital-intensive infrastructure like manure pits and manure injection equipment, as Tucker mentioned, the federal government has a very poor track record for protecting farms and farmers and farmland and farm workers from big capital, from consolidation, from agribusiness. It has a poor record protecting communities and the environment from agriculture and other toxics proactively with a precautionary principle as opposed to reactively. The EPA check and and global government policies is not represented by the presence of dairy farmers in this room. It's rather evidenced by the decades of precipitous decline of dairy farmers in our communities. This was not and is not an inevitable outcome of some apolitical form of quote unquote progress. This is a direct result of what Oxfam calls governments willingly handing power to corporations. We just cannot accept this as inevitable progress. There are thousands of farmers who do not have their farms right now who are not farming. So in terms of the AIB, in this conversation about deferring to the AIB in its processes, we are disappointed by the AIB report and its conclusions. The primary concerns they related to needing more research related to seed corn maggot, the supply of seed, and potential impact of the halo effect, we feel are not reasonable barriers to making clear and substantial steps now to reducing the use of neonics and supporting farmers in transitioning, in particular given the data on environmental impacts, yields, and farm economics. If there is residual related to the halo effect, then there is some degree of residual effect. I think that the concern with the halo effect is primarily that it exists. Its very existence is another reason to phase out widespread neonic as soon as possible, not to prolong this action any further. This bill does provide some time. It's not perfect. There's been a question of whether or not policy is the most effective approach. We have seen in Quebec, the EU, and other locations that policy has been an effective approach. I think that's the best data we have on that. So I just want to acknowledge farmers have real concerns about transitioning. You heard it from many of them here. You'll probably hear more today. And farmers have real concerns about being exposed. There are more than 6,000 farms in Vermont and many other food producers as well, the homestead scale or non-commercial scale, and they are all being impacted. Pollinator-dependent crops in Vermont include apples, squash, peppers, melons, sunflowers, buckwheat, tomatoes, blueberries, cherries, and others. As you know, the Vermont Beekeepers Association reminds us that according to VAFM's own stats, Vermont beekeepers have lost at least 25% of their bees during the winter months for the last 3 years. And the Bee Informed Partnership, which is a national organization tracking U.S. honeybee colony losses, reports combined summer and winter losses for Vermonters much higher at 35 to 85% each year for the past 4 years. Farmers irrigate from surface waters, and the Vermont Agency of Ag has reported neonicotinoid residues in nearly all surface waterways in Vermont. These chemicals are persistent and they spread. We've seen data of residues at varying soil depths on land planted and not planted with neonics from Heather and from others. The vast majority of farms and farmers do not rely on neonics, but all farmers rely on beneficial insects, soil health, water quality, seeds, and the right to decide what happens on their farm to their crops in their bodies. So we want to support farmers who need to transition. We acknowledge the many particular challenges they face in relationship to this and more broadly. We do not have all the answers. We hope that these farmers can also understand the concerns of the farmers and farm workers and other producers who are not using the chemicals and this sort of aspect they are experiencing with a non-consensual exposure and potential exposure of their crops and their land and the biology on that land. We need to work together. And I think one of the things that frustrated me was how different parties, whether it was folks coming in from the environmental side or folks coming in from the farming side, sort of chose to engage in some data or not, or just did or didn't and choose engage in some data. So in our hope, everyone can engage with the details and the data of the situation. There's what is treated and what needs to be treated. So according to pesticide usage data by EPA-FM, you all have heard this, but 99.6% of corn seed in Vermont is treated with neonics, 34% with soybeans across 90,000 and 7,000 acres respectively. In other words, farmers are nearly universally planting neonic-treated seed to prophylactically address potential pest issues and very rarely benefiting from the uses, and on a net level are not economically benefiting even in crops that don't rely on bees. To these farmers, as Tucker and others attested, it's seen as cheap crop insurance. Get the greatest yield, the least risk. It's better than insurance, actually. You heard Tucker talk about the inadequacies of crop insurance. He said, it's better than insurance in this sense because you actually salvage the crop versus only having a tiny percentage of the value the crop would give you in the event of a pest-related loss. But the reality is to everyone else, it's seen as widespread and unnecessary use of a toxic chemical. This is the externality sort of the savings that the farmer's insurance is for them. The risk and impact is put somewhere else, at the very least, as borne out by the data and by those people who are not using them, feel impacted by them. We can acknowledge the ecological impacts. I really don't feel like I need to get into them. That science is there. Residual, we talk about spreading in soils and water, the impacts on human and non-human communities, seed supply and cost, insurance and real costs of crop loss, research, farm needs versus community needs. I just think that all these things, when someone comes here and sits in front of you, I would love if all these things could be ideally addressed. I thought it was Stephen came in here from the Agency of Ag and really didn't deal with many of these actual data points or discussing them. It was really a framing of sort of concerns related to the general state of the ag community and how this could impact people. But getting into the data is really important. We need to grapple with this and figure out how to move forward. We understand that Quebec and other places are not the same as Vermont ecologically, agriculturally, or politically. But we also do not believe that the experience of Europe, Ontario, Quebec, and New York are not relevant to Vermont farmers or a path forward. The biggest concerns we've heard, and happy to hear more, are supply of seed, loss, and insurance, only potential crop loss, and insurance only covering a minuscule bit. Not enough research on seed corn maggot or other aspects of this discussion. And from what I heard, many of those who spoke with the concerns about the bill were not always speaking against it. They were sometimes aligning the timeline with New York or talking about how the exemptions could be changed and otherwise. So these are things we can also talk about to think about how we can accommodate and work to support farmers in a real way, not just in a tokenized way, in a real way. And I think the question that comes to my mind is, in the event of loss from organisms otherwise treated by neonics on these farms, if appropriate management methods are used, is there funding to support farmers? As we know, losses far exceed insurance payouts. That's the think piece that the legislature should really look at. What can we do to account for that scenario? So with this work in Vermont, we hope to grow the movement of more states taking action in the US. We know that there are efforts underway in other states. Hopefully seed companies will work with farmers using these products now, and farmers here will have the varieties they need at a cheaper price, as we've seen in other localities, and have healthier soils and biological webs, and the other farms and community members not using them will be far less exposed, and we will gradually reduce and eliminate the systemic load of neonics now in our environment and be more, have more of our own self-determination as farmers and as a state in relationship to our food, how we grow it. There was a lot of discussion here about the New York bill. I'm happy to respond to comments, but that's all I have written for now. Take questions.
Thank you, Graham. I want to just say, sort of the public service announcement, that the audio went out at least briefly, maybe longer than briefly before we realized it. So anyone who's listening and noticed that, your testimony will be available on our website. We'll post it, the written copy of your testimony.
Get you a copy after childcare stuff this afternoon.
So yes, so it's not posted right now. It will be by the end of the day, or as soon as we're able to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as soon as we're able to post that. Questions? Committee. Okay. Well, Graham, thank you. Appreciate your coming in today.
Having you soon.
Let's keep moving here so that we're able to get back on track. VJ, just come on.
Morning.
Good morning.
I'll first introduce members of our team. We'll be speaking to you a little later. Brian Kemp is the president of the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition. Marie Audette is from Blue Spruce Farm in Bridport, and Tim Kehat is a Kehat Brothers Farm in Addison. And all of us collectively will be happy to answer your questions. But thank you again for giving us this opportunity to present before the committee. So my name is Vijay Nazareth. I'm the executive director at CVFC. I've been with the organization since July 2022, and Brian will talk a little bit more about what we do in a second. I've spent most of my career in the private sector, probably 25 years and maybe 10 years in global food security with the DC-based think tank, and now with the coalition as well. At my core, I'm probably, people will tell you, a problem solver and a consensus builder. To bring people together with different points of view and find pragmatic, practical solutions to problems. And that's the approach we have taken with the letter that we presented to the committee earlier. So just so you know, the letter that we submitted, the written testimony, has the approval of both dairy farmers and beekeepers. We have both in our coalition. And when we sent it around to all our members, beekeepers got back to us and said, we think this is a balanced approach and we think it's reasonable. So once again, coming together to solve problems, and that's the approach we've taken here. The New York bill, which was talked about extensively this morning, is something we support. We think it's a pretty balanced view. It addresses the issues that beekeepers are facing with neonics, addresses the environmental issues, and it also mitigates risk for dairy farmers as well. So it does all three. So it's something that we think resonates well with our members, and it's something we'd like to support. What's really important in the New York bill, in our view, is the time frame of 5 years. It's not officially law, as the attorney pointed out this morning, but it looks like that's the way it's heading. And we think the additional time is really important to allow for additional seed supply to come into the market, both in terms of quantity and the varieties of seeds that farmers use today. We've talked about research and the need for additional research and alternative seed treatments, that's going to take time as well. So time is really useful from that standpoint. Crop insurance, another provision for farmers who may face losses. We think that needs to be addressed too. And we think the waiver provision in New York is an effective one, even if it's on an individual farm basis. So we think having that provision in there is something that farmers would benefit from as well. When we look at the legislation from a macro standpoint, we think, helping one group and hurting another group is not the way to go. It has to be a win-win for everyone to be effective legislation. And we think the New York bill kind of does that. So we're happy to support the New York bill. And I'm at this point going to turn it over to Brian Kemp, our president, who will talk to you a little bit of the coalition If you have questions about the letter itself, I'll be happy to take them right now. And then we'll have Marie and Tim talk to you as well.
Great. Go ahead, Mike.
Just because you mentioned specifically the waiver in the New York bill, do you take issue with anything in the waiver in this bill, or?
I think the way it's written, it's an exemption as
Yeah.
opposed to a waiver. And you talked about who has authority over it. Was the Agency of Ag or ANR? With the Agency of Ag having sort of authority over pesticide use, we think the waiver from the Agency of Ag is the appropriate course forward and the best way to sort of handle that. 'Cause,
Outside of who is issuing it?
yeah, we won't really have a major issue with that. But if we think that's a waiver and exemption, it's an important thing to have in case farmers have crop losses.
Thanks.
Other questions? John?
How would you like to see an appeal for a waiver work? Is that like, I should have asked.
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think there is a risk assessment tool that New York is working through Cornell, from what I understand. And I think that has to be completed a year before. And based on conditions in your farm and what you believe the risk factors might be for the following season, you can request a waiver. So it's not an exact science, and the more data that goes into the model, the more precise it'll become over time. But I think that's the tool that's being used or being contemplated anyway in New York. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Brian and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing us to have this time. My name is Brian Kemp. I'm actually an organic beef farmer in Addison and Rutland counties. But here today, I'm representing the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, and I'm the president of that group. We are a group of farmers that unified over a dozen years ago, 12 original directors. We're a very diverse group of ag. We covered predominantly Addison, Chittenden, Rutland, and a few other surrounding counties. Our membership now is over 80 plus active farm members, and we have supporting businesses that support us in our endeavors. Our initial interest in our group was to have a unified voice for ag, and we were dealing with water quality issues at the time. And that's still our mission and goal, is to provide clean water, soil health, and practices, new innovative practices that embrace that. We've changed our farming tactics a lot over the last dozen to 15 years. No-till, cover crops, increasing soil health, manure injection. All these practices are proof that farmers in Vermont are working towards the better goal of clean water and protecting the environment, but the whole time keeping our farms sustainable and resilient. We're a very diverse group, predominantly dairy, as you may expect. But we have beef, we have orchards, we have vineyards, we have beekeepers, we have veggie growers, dairy, beef, goat, lamb, everything. We're very diverse, and we understand, that the concerns of the pollinators and all, and many of us have practices on our farm to help enhance the pollinators with buffers and pollinator protection or planting on our farms. I think we do embrace this bill from New York because it's kind of, to me, a middle of the road. It's given some time, and I would encourage that we have that extended time like New York has, rather than rushing into this in a year or two, like is proposed in the Vermont bill. I think the seed companies, need time to adapt. Farmers do a lot of experimenting and have learned what works on their farms, in their soils, and every farm's different. And if farmers are narrowed down to just select seed varieties and certain day lengths, because that's what the seed companies are going to provide, it's going to be challenging. And I think there needs to be time there for that, for the industry to adapt. And I also feel like, the it's been discussed about the protection. You know, this could be catastrophic on farms if a pest issue comes in on a particular spring and wipes out a lot of crops. And a farm currently, if they have to replant, can go select a shorter day corn. You know, they had 105-day corn, they may be have to go to a 95-day. If the seed companies don't have the time to adapt to have those, they're going to really be limited. And as a personal experience as an organic farmer, I face that a lot of times. We have limited seed available on the organic side. Matter of fact, I got an email yesterday on my alfalfa that I ordered. It's not available. So my options are to get an untreated alfalfa seed or start shopping around to other organic, which is what I'll do. But it's just an example of what could happen. You know, there's just, and I hate to see that on the conventional side, these farmers be limited and lose a tool, you know, that they have right now at their mercy. So I know we've got two others. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I would just, you know, take any questions now.
Representative O'Brien first.
Just quickly, Brian, what would the alfalfa seed be treated for?
The alfalfa that we purchased, organic, limited availability, just very challenging for the seed companies. We see it again and again, that there's been a catastrophic event and they don't have the seed out for the demand. And so you have to source from other companies, or in some cases, there's exemptions where you can get an untreated conventional seed. You know, so but it's real. And I think it would be, you know, in this with a shorter window and not an extended timeline, I think it could become, you know, even more catastrophic for the conventional industry because they just would be limited to what they could source. So
Are you saying in your case, you in an emergency, or you could plan a conventional and still
some of the companies get them approved. The conventional companies do get it approved through OMRI, which is the national level, and then VOF, Vermont Organic Farmers, has to also, you know, approve that. Typically, they do. If OMRI approves it, NOFA Vermont will approve it. But it's you know, it's a challenge. You still, you know, this getting late in the year to find things, and that would be you know, that would really be in May when everybody's planning, and then all of a sudden late May we get a pest issue. You know, for people to scramble to get a short day corn that's not treated, it might not be there. You know, we plant extra population to compensate organically. You know, typically we're planting 34,000 plants per acre to hope we're getting 32 in the field. And some of that's due to pests. Some of it's just the vulnerability of organic seeds because you want the ground warmer. You're fighting not only maybe a pest issue, but weed pressures. So, you know, I've been there. I've done it. I experience what, you know, conventional farmers may be facing going down the road if things are rushed and there's not time for the research and for the seed companies to catch up.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, Brian, just to clarify, are alfalfa seeds treated with neonicotinoids? And if they are, can you use them as an organic beef producer?
No, they're not typically, but there's some of the alfalfa seeds will have coatings on them to just protect, like a leafhopper. It's not a true neonicotinoid. But leafhopper is you know, it's something that comes up in the jet stream from the south that can damage alfalfa. For example, they'll eat the leaves. So, and we see it sometimes, some years, not every year.
And does that treatment still qualify as an organic feed?
You have to it has to be almost like this bill, an exemption, you know, because you can't source other organic seeds. Yeah. It has to be pre-approved.
And Templeman?
In the spirit of teasing out unintended consequences, I'm wondering if you feel that banning neonicotinoid seeds could have an effect on tilling. And if you could speak on that, just based on your own experience and conjecture, do you feel like banning neonicotinoid seeds could increase the level of tilling?
There is some studies out there that are saying, unfortunately, cover crops can add to the problem of unfavorable, insects and rotating out of grass also. We do that. We rotate out of grass on our farm. But here we're all using cover crops, even organically or not, and conventionally. And now some of the research is saying that can elevate the levels of pests. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. We all believe in cover crops. We're building soil health and all, but we're also possibly giving a better host to some of these insects. So the result could be more tillage. Yes, it could be an unintended consequence. If you're going in and planting a crop and it's sacrificed and having to replant, yeah, to some degree.
Good.
Well, unless there's other questions, I want to give my constituents.
I don't see any others, so thank you. Thanks very much, Brian. Morning.
Good morning. This is not my natural thing to do, so I'm sorry if I'm a little nervous, but
We all understand that. If you can just tell us your name and who
my
you're.
name is Marie Audette. I'm from Blue Spruce Farm and also Audette's Cow Power, a dairy farm in Bridport, Vermont. We're multi-generation. There's 20 of us on the farm, and we're raising, we have at least 6 kids now under the age of 9. So we're really enjoying the full effects of the multi-generations. And, that's just a reason that we care so much, so passionately about all these things. And I'm so encouraged by your question and your question just now. Those are the questions that we have. And that's what we're asking. Let's get that research done so that we are really well prepared to transition. We have proven to you guys as a community how well we can evolve, change, adapt, adopt. And, just to give you, I should give you, last year we grew 1,400 acres of corn, 450 acres of soybean, our first time, and over 2,000 acres of hay to feed our 1,500 registered Holsteins and Ashers and replacements, about 1,500 of the same number. So we also collect, we continue to close the loop on our farm. So we keep adding another level to do better all the time. Cow Power's old now, it's back in 2005, we had a digester and the Cow Power program came out. Unbelievable addition to our farm cycle. And we're able to provide bedding for other farms so that we're not importing sawdust on our farms because we're recycling our crops, not only to feed, we grow them first to feed cows, obviously. And then the cows let it out the other end. There's still plenty of value there, right? So we're generating renewable energy for our community. Matter of fact, in our community, a third of the power that's in the Weybridge substation comes from the cow power farms that feed it. So it's not, it's a little something to contribute while we're going down the pike here. And from there, we separate the solids out of it after it's been digested and make the power, and the liquid is what we recycle to fertilize the fields. It goes back on the field. And then the plant fibers that didn't digest, that's what we use for bedding for our cows. And if some of our neighbors who don't have digesters, we've been supplying it for a decade for them too. So there's a lot of stuff. And then lately, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've added, in the interest of water quality, we've added a DAF system, which is basically a system that processes the manure, collects the phosphorus from it. So 70 to 78% of the phosphorus gets separated out, because that's really a factor that keeps us from using as much of the fertilizer that we want. We want all the organic matter in our manure, but we don't need all the phosphorus in every field. So this gives us that option of more precision agriculture. And we just have had a call from a Texas place. This kid, he's not a kid anymore, he's 40. He was a kid at Middlebury College. And back then, he used to ride his 10-speed to our farm and collect manure from the digester. And he went ahead and created this really successful company, which he recently sold, that turns the effluent into potable water. So now he wants to bring his next project on our farm to do the same thing that DAF does, just differently. So we're going to have a second technology that may be easier for farms of all sizes to implement. So we're starting to just give you an idea that we're always doing something. And that's what I love about our coalition. We sit around this table. We've been doing it since the RAPs were starting to establish, and we were realizing we had to come to the table and roll up our sleeves and come talk to you guys and work together. And every single farmer understands our role in our society. Our communities are so unique in Vermont because our farms are next door neighbors to everyone else, right? It's not like out west. You don't think about the food being grown there. It's not in the middle of your community. So I think that's what's unique to Vermont, and that's, what brings us here. There's a place here that I wanted to show you some of the work that we've done, because I just want to put a fine point to, the conservation practices you've all become very familiar with, because all the farmers have been telling you about them. So I won't tell you about them, but maybe you haven't heard that the adoption of these practices, Vermonters actually lead the nation. Between 2012 and 2017, we increased areas of no-till by 173%. The biggest increase in the United States, and that's only through 2017. And same thing with the adoption of cover crops. We have over 100% increase in adaptation of cover crops. So when we learned what that could do for our farm, when we figured out how to adopt these practices, we made it all happen. And we're going to do the same thing with these neonicotinoids. The only thing we need is to mitigate our risks. So we're building these systems to mitigate water quality, for example, but we really rely on our corn to feed our cows. Just this past week, UVM Extension was out to the farm, and what they're focusing on is growing more of our own grain within our watersheds. You probably know we're importing a lot of grain. And we also know what it means to import, right? We're bringing nutrients into our watersheds. Thank you for shaking your head. That's what we're trying to close that loop. And I think you might be surprised to hear how much is happening in that regard. Not only is UVM on top of it, which is a good sign, we really rely on their research and help and support. But we on our farm decided, seeing this as a potential sustainability builder for us, to build a grain facility. So if you ever travel down 22A, our farm is right there. You'll see on the other side these grain things that don't normally belong in Vermont. But it's a learning curve for us. We made the investment, and that's why we are growing soybeans, and we're learning how to grow them, how to plant them. We're learning all these things and relying on each other. To our surprise, I think my family would agree, at least 8 farmers that are in our watershed, neighbors that used to be dairy farmers that don't have cows anymore, they're growing crops. And they used to be sending them to New York and going to New Jersey with them, and then they're eliminating a middleman and selling it to us. So I can see a huge potential here to really grow, a base to have our own cropping system. The other thing that UVM and our nutritionists, what you might find interesting, if you care about water quality a lot, like we all do, if Blue Spruce, for example, was to not grow our own grain, our own corn crop, we'd have to import 1/3 more food, and that would bring in 7.5% more phosphorus that we'd have to manage on our farm. So we really don't want to do that. Corn is a really helpful crop, and it's really nice, Graham. Thank you for pointing that out. I could agree with just about everything Graham said, and I'll tell you the one thing I might not agree with perfectly. Another thing that's happening, and I just have to share this because it's exciting stuff, and you guys are sitting here all the time, and you're saying, "Oh, these poor farmers." I hear you all the time, and it's like, no, there's good stuff going on. Dr. Joshua Faulkner, I don't know if you've ever had him in front of you. Good. So he's a UVM, he's got a really long title, but he's a climate change specialist, basically, for UVM Extension Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So he's part of a nationwide multi-million dollar, multi-year study that is connecting all these practices you've been hearing about to actual impacts on climate and on air. In other words, if we're going to, put the manure underground, like you've heard we do, what does that do to the field that's being sprayed? So they're coming on farms in Addison County right now, and they're measuring this stuff. This is going to be almost a 10-year study. It's not just like a flash in the pan and, we'll get 1 year's worth of data. This is going to affect how we farm, and we'll measure how we can contribute better to society by implementing these different practices. Basically, that's all. The one thing I will say, is I do think when I read the IAB and I read the people that they had in there and some of the concerns, I think there's a lot of valid stuff that concerns us that we want time to flesh out. And I don't think that's unreasonable ask. This whole thing I'm talking about, growing our own grain, you can imagine how having one of these safety nets pulled out, makes us nervous. So please support our growth in that way in the state and find a reasonable way. And that's why, I'm so glad so many people are kind of liking the New York bill, because it kind of does protect everyone that is affected. And there's a safety net if something happens, and because we have ever in the past had whole crops disappear. That's a very frightening thing.
Can you imagine, Representative Lipsky has a question.
Yeah, Marie, thank you. As someone who's observed Blue Spruce Farm for a long time, the only thing you didn't mention that was environmentally spectacular and huge is your wind turbine. How is that helped in your energy conservation return?
Well, I will tell you this. It would take almost 30 of those wind turbines to make the same amount of power as the cows do on our farm. But we did it as an experiment at the time. There was a big push for all these things. And we've had literally thousands and thousands of visitors since 2005 on our farm. It didn't stop till COVID. And then I let my hair go white and I'm saying we're done. But the wind turbine was always, it was really fun to have, because I would always say, see, not everyone has cows to make renewable energy, but everyone can maybe put on a wind turbine. And do you see any dead birds? Can you hear it? The traffic is louder than that. So I think it was a nice way to showcase the potential for wind, but it's really died down in the state. It's like, they don't see them. Most of our neighbors liked it. They thought it fit well with the aesthetics of the farm. We asked them first, of course, but worked out well for us.
John?
Marie, can you just describe how working with your nutritionist, how this works when you're starting to do soybeans, so that, chocolate bars and orange pulp and the other stuff we heard about that comes in, that can be replaced then?
Mm-hmm. Especially cornmeal. We had to bring in a lot of cornmeal. So, those other things, they still can contribute some really affordable energy and can be, mixed in. So Tim is probably way smarter than me when it comes to the nutritional balance thing. But working with everything on the farm gets planned, it gets measured, it gets reported because we're an LFO. And we analyze everything we do on a year-to-year basis. I was surprised when I heard some of the many varieties of corn some farms have to use depending on where they are. I was joking in the car with my friends here that we have pretty solid Virgins clay. So we're basically around 5-6 varieties, and we analyze and change. It often happens we have at the last minute have to substitute and get some shorter day corn. Weather's going to keep happening. Oh, and there's another statistic too. I looked up for you guys because I heard you ask of another farmer. It's like, okay, you're doing all these practices. What's it doing on your organic matter? So I took some fields that we have, the same test for from from 2008, for example, when we were first starting these regenerative practices. And then I looked at the same fields, and there's 100 and almost 200 fields here. And the average increase was 1.3. So, for every point of organic matter that you increase, you can sequester, you could hold 20,000 gallons more water per acre. So in these main events like we had last July, it was really interesting to hear Secretary Julie Moore at our annual meeting comment on how these adaptation of these conservation practices along with, wetlands conservation says mitigated the damage that, I mean, as bad as it was, would have been much worse. So it's really nice to hear that from her as well.
That was on your.
No.
1.3 was,
Pardon?
you mentioned what the increase was 1.3. Was that your?
My farm, I don't have everyone else's records, but you guys are interested in how is it building soil, and yes.
Thank you for bringing that. Yeah, number. Yep, Dave.
So on that note, I'd love to dig in that deeper. So you started no-till in 2008, you say?
Oh, boy. These are earning questions, my brother-in-law.
Okay, but I think that's.
Brian, do you know when we started?
I don't know as you started no-till then, but you've probably been doing it.
A long time. We haven't used plows in forever.
Okay, so let's say
Big enough.
11 years,
Mhm.
you've seen a 1.3% increase of organic material, not carbon, but organic material. Carbon's usually half of that amount, right? So before that, you were tilling regularly, and now you do the cover crops, and do you spray with herbicide to kill down before you planting corn?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
John.
Just one more thing. So you never have grown corn for cornmeal. Sounds like it's mostly silage, right?
In the past.
Yeah.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
We have picked corn when we could. When you get the corn and just crush that. And that works great. Wish we could do a lot of that because I'm the bookkeeper, so I see how well that works, the numbers on the farm.
But soy seems like a better option than picking, like doing 1,000 acres of big corn.
Yeah. There's a new soy variety that I was just told about yesterday that I think all the farmers, do you remember what it's called?
It's oleic value in the soybean is
Yeah.
beneficial to the nutrient balance in the ration that we're fed to the dairy cows. This allows us to get fat into the cow's rumen without having to purchase it.
Apparently it was developed for the food industry years ago and they didn't go for it. And all of a sudden agriculture's picked it up and said, whoa, so I guess all our growers are switching to that, including ourselves, is what I just am learning yesterday.
We have Tim, were you gonna join us? Okay, yeah.
Want us to stay together?
Well, they put the other chair away, so I'll have to switch you out of it, yeah.
We get a little crowded over there.
Yeah, Mike.
I'd like to thank everyone for giving me this opportunity to come up to Montpelier today and speak on behalf of me as an individual, as a dairy producer, as a board of director on the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition. I farm in a partnership with my brother in Addison on the shores of Lake Champlain, multi-generational farm. Numerous grandfathers, uncles, brothers, relatives, all in agriculture. Take it very serious. Our role in this state and what we provide to people that come here and the value that we provide, visitors, locals, people that live here, and have always felt like it's very important to educate people and to talk about what we do and why we do it. Through the years that I've been in farming, I've seen many changes come through. We always adapt to changes. It's no secret to anyone that the margins are super tight in all kinds of agriculture, not just dairy, but all across the board. And somehow we need to figure out a way to be more efficient all the time, adapt to changing environments, adapt to labor situations, adapt to all these things that affect every business that's in our country and in our state. We plant 1,200 acres of corn. We use treated seed, obviously, because that's the way the industry has migrated. We've had years before that was available where we have witnessed loss, economic loss within our crop production. that crop insurance doesn't even come close to covering the loss that can stretch out for many, many years in our financial system on our dairy. So any tool that we can use, we look at it as an option or as something that we can use to self-insure, to mitigate our risks to whatever it may be, pests, weather, practices. So I just, like others have said, I think that the time that we need is absolutely critical. Critical to allow us to adapt, to change, critical to the seed companies to adapt. We're all in it together. So I guess that's all that I really have to say. Care deeply about our state, care deeply about the bee populations, care deeply about my dairy animals. So I just, the time is a critical thing here, and that we can't be forced to have something taken away without really knowing how to adapt to it and the economic impact that it may have on my business that would last multi-years. So.
And you just mentioned that in the past, at some point, you've had crop loss and economic loss.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about when that was and what that?
It was way before the seeds. It was almost incorporated into the seeds, back when the farmers were the ones mixing the pesticides and dealing with it on a field by field basis. I think the wild card is the weather and the farming practices that we've changed, and the stakes they get higher all the time. And so as businesses grow, as we've been, as time has progressed, it just becomes more and more of a thing that we deal with on an annual basis. I don't know that it had the size and scope of the impact that it may have been, 100 to 200 cows at that time when we had a field that was lost to maggots. But it's still in a proportionate size, had just as big of an impact on my father's business. I can promise you that.
John, are you going soy, Tim?
No, we are not currently, but it's certainly in the discussion point amongst me and my brother. Yeah.
You mentioned maggots. Are you referring to Japanese beetle larvae?
No, corn maggots, like rootworm maggots. It's an early season type pest that happens. Kind of the windows of opportunities for us to get our planning done. I wouldn't say force us to be on the spot the minute the weather breaks, because when that window closes, it's closed. And if you miss it, it's not a good time.
Great. Any other questions? Well,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming, making the drive over, and all of you for joining us. It's been helpful to hear your testimony. I think we've all been sitting for a bit, so we should probably take a break. There was another witness scheduled to come in who I don't think is able to join us, so we've got a little bit of time. Let's be back here at 5 after.